Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the Oklahoma Library Association Technical Services Roundtable Virtual Learning Module, More Than a Comic, Collecting and Organizing Graphic Novels in Your Library. My name is Michelle Owens, and I will be your learning module monitor this morning. Today's presentation is being recorded, as you heard, so please mute your mics until the end of the presentation. Next week, all registrants will receive a recording link and any additional information from today's session in a follow-up email. Today's session is worth one continuing education unit. All session attendees will receive a certificate of completion within the next 30 days, confirming the completion of this CEU. At the end of today's session, you will have an opportunity to provide feedback through an evaluation form that will be shared in the chat box, and we do encourage you to complete it. Today's presenters are Pauline Rodriguez-Atkins and Bethie Seay. Pauline has only very recently retired from the Metropolitan Library System, where she had a long and exceptional career in librarianship. Bethie is currently finishing her Master's of Library and Information Studies degree at the University of Oklahoma and is also serving as the Assistant Technical Services Librarian at the University of Oklahoma in Tulsa. Welcome to you both. Please feel free to place your questions in the chat box throughout today's presentation. I will be monitoring it and will share your questions with the speakers when the presentation is complete. And now I'll turn the session over to them.
All right, welcome. I will go ahead and share my screen really quick. All righty. So as Michelle introduced, I'm Bethie. Welcome to the TSRT Learning Module. I am currently the Assistant Technical Services Librarian at OU Tulsa Schusterman Library. And so I work really closely with our graphic scholarship collection. And I actually just finished my master's in library science in December. So I am free and tired.
Yay, Bethie. So I'm Pauline. As Michelle mentioned, I recently retired. Before I retired, I was Director of Collection Services and Development for the Metropolitan Library System in Oklahoma City, which, if you're not familiar, is a public library system that serves Oklahoma County with 19 libraries and centralized technical services. And if you weren't here during our earlier conversation, I think I am one of the OGs of the Technical Services Roundtable in OLA, and I'm really excited to see so many people here that I don't know, because I think it's really great that we're reaching out to our technical services community. Now, Bethie and I actually represent two ends of the spectrum: a small academic library and a large public library system. So we think there will be something here for everybody.
All right, and then as Michelle mentioned earlier, this is worth one CEU. It'll last about 50 minutes. We're going to try to save around 10 minutes at the end for Q&A and discussion. But by the end of this module, participants should be able to understand different elements of developing a comics and graphic novels collection. You should see examples from public and academic libraries and understand some common challenges with this type of collection. But first, where do you even start? Maybe you're separating existing materials from your general collection to increase their circulation or visibility, or maybe you're starting from the ground up and you're making a new collection from nothing. So to start, you should begin asking yourself and your team some questions to really solidify what you're wanting from your graphic novel collection.
So what questions should you be asking? And in a public library, it's not really hard to justify having graphic novels, because generally one of your selection criteria is public interest. But if your users can't access them, owning them isn't enough. So in 2017, I led a project to improve user access to Metropolitan's graphic novels, and we formed a discussion group, which I'll talk more about later. But these are the questions that our discussion group started with. And there are also questions that you may encounter from your administration? Does a graphic novel have to be fiction? Are collections of comic strips graphic novels? Does a graphic novel have to feature a superhero? What about children's book, picture books? Are they graphic novels? And how does manga fit in? And I want to point out there is really no one right answer. It really depends on your collection and your users. But it's a good exercise for everyone, including graphic novel readers, who may not have thought about these questions.
My library asked very similar questions when they started building our collection, which was slightly before I came on board, but it has continued to grow and evolve after I've come on board. So we've continued to ask questions like, will we only consider monographs like standalone books, or would we ever collect floppy single issues at all? Will we include academic journals about comics and comic studies texts? What about zines, either locally created or from others in the library field? And if we focus on nonfiction titles, will we ever add any fiction? And then what should the criteria be for that?
So in our discussion group, we came up with some definitions of what a graphic novel is. It's intended to be read as a whole story continuously. There was some discussion about whether manga should be rolled into the graphic novels or should be its own thing. And ultimately, for simplicity, we kept it with the graphic novels. And a graphic novel, by this definition, can be fiction or nonfiction, which hurts my cataloger brain because it says fiction. Graphic novels actually can be in electronic formats. Most users do tend to prefer physical items, and shelving issues don't apply, so we limited our access talks to print only.
My library also encountered similar brain issues with the concept of nonfiction graphic novels. It's kind of an oxymoron and it makes us very angry. But it's, that's kind of what they are, and that's what people recognize them as, is graphic novels. But so here at OU, we consider them to usually be monographs of sequential art. So the contents are primarily illustrations with one item or book telling a complete standalone story, like Pauline mentioned. And we focus on nonfiction, but we do include fiction if it fits well thematically with the rest of the collection. And we do collect a few journals and scholarly texts and some graphic titles that are part of a series, but we mainly focus on traditional graphic novel book formats that are nonfiction. So nonfiction novels again. We do include manga if it fits with the collection's vision, and we've begun to incorporate zines more recently as well.
So thinking about a public library, we also came up with some things that are not graphic novels. So if you're in a public library, you know that collections of comic strips are a big deal. We have tons of Garfield, Zits, whatever. But they're generally not intended to be read continuously. Maybe there's a gag that runs for a few strips, but that's it. When we decided this, we had a discussion about the fact that there are comic strips that are serialized, like Superman, Dick Tracy, where a story goes on and builds for quite a period of time. So we basically decided that if it's published in a format other than daily, like in a comic book, then it is considered a graphic novel. If it's text-based, even if it has cartoon illustrations, it is not a graphic novel. And at Metropolitan, we have specific shelving areas for adult, young adult, and children's materials. And then children's are further subdivided on reading levels. And that's pretty common among public libraries. So for us, having the cutoff be third grade reading level addresses the question of whether picture books or for pre-readers or beginning readers actually are graphic novels. Since we cut it off at that reading level, it solves that problem. In 2017, when our initial project happened, we actually excluded everything before a 5th grade reading level. And 5 years later, in 2022, our group got back together, headed by our new cataloging head, and discovered that the market had exploded. So they went back and corrected it and added the 3rd grade reading levels.
And most of the issues with cutting off at certain reading ages or reading levels, luckily that hasn't been a concern at my library with our collection. Because we're in an academic setting, we don't really collect juvenile materials. We have bought some inadvertently, and I'll get to that a little bit later, but our focus is on YA and above. And we actually try not to collect that many young adult titles. We try to mostly collect titles sort of geared towards adults. Memoirs, biographies are very common in our collection. And while we do collect some text about comic studies, those titles are only meant to augment the collection, and they're sort of off in their own little sub-collection. And so then next, you should start asking what you intend to get out of your collection. What are your goals? Do you want your collection to focus on research, either full of nonfiction graphic works, or do you want it to be a collection of traditional comics intended to be the subject of researchers? Or will your collection be for leisure reading and entertainment? Does your library do any special programming already, or have niche research areas? Or does your community have any local interests that could be highlighted? What age ranges do you want to target? Will there be something for everyone? Will you keep it to juvenile titles, or will it be catered to adult reading levels? And what type of content matter are you willing to include in your collection? What kinds of materials do you want to include? And your answers to the question, what is a graphic novel, can help you out a lot there, as you may consider floppy single issues, comic strip collections, standalone monographs, manga, or zines. And then also be thinking about the budget, which isn't fun, but is necessary. Is it coming out of the regular collection budget each year, or will you have a separate chunk dedicated to your comic collection? If you've got some team members with grant writing experience or that want to get into grant writing, consider applying for external funding like ALA's Eisner Graphic Novel Grant. And then always be considering all of your costs. Like, not only do you have to buy the books themselves, you might have to pay for shipping. You'll need extra supplies like your labels, your stamps, your covers. You'll need shelf space. So do you have the square footage in your building to accommodate it? And then what type of shelving units do you need? Because those cost money. Do you need signage? Can you produce that in-house, or will you have to pay for it? And what's your wayfinding like in your space already? And then you'll need staff hours to do all of this work that could be spent doing other projects. And potentially you might need staff training if you need to teach them how to do cataloging or send them to conferences to learn about comics. And then consider the possibility of retrospective projects later on down the line, because you may decide to label your collection a certain way in the beginning, only to later find out that it doesn't serve your users and you need to go back and relabel everything. That takes time and supplies and sometimes tears, so Kleenex should be a budget item too. And as an example for the collection goals, my library collects graphic materials with academic rigor, curricular relevance, cultural discussion topics, topics of local interest, and local creators with a primary focus on nonfiction.
To follow up on that, in a public library, you may or may not have a separate collection development policy or budget for your graphic novels. My library did not, because, as I mentioned, one of our criteria for selection was popularity. People want graphic novels, so in a public library, you are going to buy them. And anything added to our collection in any form has to meet the same basic criteria. So with those in mind, we didn't really set any separate standards for our graphic novels.
regardless of whether your collection development policy is part of your general policy or whether you're creating a new one that's specific to your graphic novels, write it down. Get your collection development policy written down, and you can always make adjustments to it as the collection evolves, but set some guidelines for yourself and your team to help you stay focused on what you really want to get into the collection. Policies also help us protect our collections from challenges when they come up. So get your procedures in writing and get your leadership to sign off on it. Because also they can't sign off on anything if it's not written down. So if you're making a proposal for a new collection or collection changes, they'll want it written down anyway.
And of course, in public libraries, as we all know, graphic novels are becoming the subject of challenges more and more. In my library, our challenges had really ramped up the last year that I was working. But procedures are also important. You need to make sure that everybody's doing the same task the same way. And if you're going to have, in my situation, multiple libraries and people in each of those libraries doing certain things, they all need to be doing it the same way.
And then once you figure out where you want to go and you've got it written down and you've got someone signed off on it so that you can actually do it, how are you going to get your titles? That can be a big concern if you're not familiar with collecting comics or graphic novels. But you can start with popular reading lists based on your collection goals, like Goodreads or awards lists, or even the graphic medicine bibliography, if that's relevant to your goals. Publishers Weekly runs an announcement feature a few times a year that highlights titles by genre and age group. And they even recently started doing an announcement section just for graphic novels, which was a game changer for my library. New and popular bestsellers can always help build momentum and interest in your collection while it grows. So don't be afraid to get mainstream titles. It's okay to have niche topics that your collection focuses on, but you need to get people in the door. And then if you want to collect zines, the acquisition process can be a can of worms sometimes. A lot of zines are funded through Kickstarter or Patreon, and your institution may not be able to pay through those channels. I've recently run into a similar issue with a mental health zine series that takes payment in the form of a donation, and my institution can't donate to other nonprofits. But you can always reach out to the zine creators and ask if there are any other arrangements that can be made, but also be wary that some zine creators prefer anonymity and may be hesitant to have their titles in a library collection. So always be courteous about that. But then also consider whether local comic shops are an option for your library. Could you work out a deal with a local vendor to buy new titles through them or have them set aside new issues if you're collecting floppies? And then reach out to your patrons and come out with a way to take requests. For example, you could have an online form to fill out if someone thinks a title should be added to the collection, which sort of offloads some collection development duties onto your patrons, which is sneaky but really helpful. And then for longer series, interlibrary loan will be your best friend if it's not already. Especially when just starting out, consider only buying the first 1 or 2 issues of a series and then promoting your ILL service if patrons want to read later issues, especially if you're collecting manga. That can take up so much shelf space and just it doesn't end. It never ends.
No, actually, ILL was part of my area when I was working. And one of the things that we did was looked at what our users were asking to borrow and started trying to consider buying those titles. But to make effective access decisions, you need to know what users expect. So when I formed the discussion group back in 2017, we used library staff, mostly public services, but we had to have some tech services people involved because they would be implementing the decisions. So I asked for volunteers who met one of these 3 criteria. They were either graphic novel readers, they worked with graphic novel readers, or they shelve graphic novels. And you get a lot of good information that way. Some idea may sound wonderful, but when you start talking to the person who's going to have to shelve it, it's not so great. You could do this, though, in any size of library. I would definitely say you need to have public service because they know what your users are asking for, but your graphic novel readers could actually be some of your users. If it's a small library, your public service staff probably know who the biggest graphic novel readers are, and they would, as Bethie mentioned, probably be thrilled to help. So once we had our definition of graphic novels, we went on to try to figure out how users look for graphic novels. So those answers informed our process going forward. And at Metropolitan, our users actually ranged from elementary school to adults. And like a lot of public library users, they preferred to browse rather than use the catalog. Especially among younger users, they tended to ask for a series or character. As it was described to me, they would come up, "Where are your Spider-Man books?" Of course, they also would come wanting to know where the graphic novels were. They expected there to be a separate section for the graphic novels. And they tended to ask, they really, really want the series to be in order. So keep that in mind no matter what.
I was surprised to find out how many users in my academic library browse instead of use the catalog, because I assumed that everybody would just, always be using the catalog, try to avoid talking to a human being if at all possible, get your call number, go to the stacks, get your book, check it out and leave. No, they're browsing the shelves. They're asking us how to use the catalog. And so we had to sort of take a step back at one point and rethink how we were shelving our graphic novels, because the call numbers sort of made sense and then sometimes didn't make sense, and nobody could browse and nobody knew where anything was.
Which kind of leads into the barriers to access, because browsing users were very frustrated that there wasn't a separate area for graphic novels. They were basically shelved in with the rest of the fiction. And in many public libraries, fiction tends to be classified by genre, all the mysteries together, all the science fiction together. And so in my library system, by the way, we did all of our cataloging, processing, everything in-house. But so we had very specific guidelines. This is what makes it science fiction. This is what makes it a mystery. But the graphic novels tended to be either science fiction or general fiction. So Batman was fiction, Superman was science fiction. And it was really hard to determine which one was which. And unfortunately, we weren't super consistent. And then our fiction materials, of course, were alphabetized on the shelf by the main entry. The first 3 letters of the main entry were on the spine label, and the shelving. The shelvers were taught to follow what was on the spine label. So as Bethie will discuss in a little bit, establishing main entry for graphic novels is tricky. But to complicate it further, graphic novel series can switch authors in midstream, which really makes it hard to keep them together if you're shelving by author. And there's also the fact that users follow specific character universes, and neither author nor title accounts for them. Plus, age levels are a big deal in public libraries, especially now. You really don't want to be sending a 4th grader to the adult area for the Spider-Man books. So the decisions had to be implemented in all the areas separately. And to give you a vision, I said we had 19 libraries. We were establishing 3 separate shelving areas in each of those 19 libraries. And that was an adventure. Just as a quick mention, nonfiction graphic novels were and are classified by Dewey, but we did put them in the same shelving area as the graphic novels.
And then at my library, no matter the collection, we use Library of Congress, even for fiction. So that opened a little bit some problems that I'll get into later. But when we first started out the collection, that was one of the first decisions we made, is to make a separate shelving area for our graphic novels. And we just kept the classifications that came with the copy cataloged records or that we already had on the books. So we were just sort of, putting them on the shelf like we would any other book from the collection. And we didn't have to worry about series for the most part. So we didn't have to worry about characters being split up based on what universe they were in. But regardless, people couldn't browse by the call numbers because they weren't using the call numbers. They were just looking at the books to browse and they couldn't navigate.
So we ended up establishing these goals for our graphic novels in our library. We wanted the classification to be consistent. We wanted to keep works featuring a specific character together, keep each series together, and keep each series in order. And sometimes to do this, you can't really do it within the cataloging rules. So when I've taught cataloging, I always talk about what I refer to as my big rule, which is do what works for your library and your users. If the cataloging rules aren't helping your users, then find something that does.
That's really the main point of this too, is every example we're giving is just an example. Your library could be completely different and none of these ideas may work out. But that's the great part, is that you can do whatever you want. And so as you try to decide on labeling, there are a lot of options. And some of them just don't work. A lot of them don't work. But you may want to shelf list alphabetically by the title or series, or alphabetically by the character or storyline, which gets really tricky around superhero comics with slightly different titles. As Pauline mentioned earlier, it's messy. And then for nonfiction, you might use the Library of Congress to shelf list by discipline, or you might use Dewey if you're in a public library. And then when you need to know the primary contributor, like if you're going by the author name, or if you're trying to come up with the cutter number for the Library of Congress call number, check the title verso always, which it seems like such a simple rule, but even I forget it sometimes, and I'll go back and look and be like, oh, I forgot that, I messed that up. You can't take the cover at its word. The artist might be listed before the writer on the title verso, or the creators might be listed more extensively on the title verso than on the cover. It's awful. And I've seen typos on covers too. The spine and the cover will have one word different in the title than the actual title is. It's insane. And then when you get to the labeling, which is, I think, is the fun part. Are you going to put genre stickers on it? Are you going to have little symbols? Are you going to color code them? At my library, we have our graphic novels, same classification system as the rest of the library, Library of Congress, but we have little clear orange label protectors on top of them. So all the call numbers are in orange instead of just white. So it's really easy to pick them out of a stack of books and go, oh, that's a graphic novel, it goes over there. And then again, like Pauline mentioned, what about when the authors change midway through a comics run? If you're doing it by character alphabetically, how are you going to keep them in order? Is it going to be chronologically by published date of when it was published, or are you going to shelve it in the order of the timeline within that universe? If you're collecting superhero comics at all, I wish you good luck.
So this is a very detailed list of how we ended up making it work in my library. And I want to stress this is one library, and this is just an example. But we decided we were going to set up graphic novel shelving sections. Then we decided we're just going to use the genre classification, general fiction for everything. So we're not going to split between fiction and science fiction. We're going to use the first 3 letters of the character name on the spine label, regardless of what the main entry is. If there is no character, like in manga, we use the first 3 letters of the series title, regardless of the main entry, or the title for that matter, or use the first 3 letters of the title, regardless of main entry. So even if it was an author main entry, we still used the title for shelving purposes. Then we included all the series numbering on all the spine labels. The staff who shelve are expected to use discretion when they're shelving each given series. So they're supposed to figure out that the Amazing Spider-Mans all go together under fiction SPI. The Complete Spider-Man all go together, and Spider-Man all go together. So it requires a little discretion on the part of the shelvers. In our case, we decided to further identify graphic novels by putting a sticker on the spine of each item. So if you pick it up and it says fiction on the spine label, but it's got a graphic novel sticker, you know where it goes. And we did establish graphic novel shelving areas for each of our major age groups. So for adult, for young adult, and for juvenile. And that has worked really well.
And then here are some recommendations for shelving in an academic library, which aren't too different from shelving in a public library. It's still, keep it in order based on what your users need. Have a separate shelving section. Otherwise, no one's going to know that you have graphic novels, especially in an academic library. Or you could integrate them into a larger leisure reading collection, but I wouldn't shelve them with textbooks per se. But use the same classification system as the rest of your collections. So if you usually use Library of Congress, then use Library of Congress or National Library of Medicine. We sort of split between Library of Congress and National Library of Medicine here because we are at a health sciences campus pretty much. So half of our graphic novels are actually using National Library of Medicine and half of them are using Library of Congress, which luckily are formatted pretty much the same way. So they mesh very, very well. But then if your leisure reading collection uses author names and you're integrating your graphic novels into that, you're going to run into the issues that Pauline was mentioning with the author names being consistent. But then always include your series numbering on all your spine labels, and consider a unique spine sticker for the graphic novels, whether it's an extra little thing at the top of the spine or it's a different color. And then eventually, you may need to change how you've labeled your items due to access or organization issues, because even with all the planning in the world, you cannot know where your collection is going to go 5-10 years down the road, or even 2, because time moves weird in a pandemic. Our collection isn't very old, but we've already had to do a retrospective classification project. And it's not the end of the world, but it does take quite a lot of time and effort. For example, I had to reclassify our graphic novel collection because the original LC call numbers weren't cutting it. Insert cutter number joke here. When we had been copy cataloging our records, the LC call numbers had assigned most titles to a really small range in the PN 6700s because the Library of Congress, I'm not going to say they don't like graphic novels, but they just classify them by what they are, which is graphic novels, instead of referring to their discipline. So if we were shelving all of these within our main collection, it would have made perfect sense because they'd all be on the same shelf right next to each other. But as soon as we took them out of the main collection and gave them their own shelf, the call numbers did not make sense and it was messy on the shelf. And we would have graduate research assistants going to pull things by call number for holds, and they weren't in call number order because people were coming and moving things on the shelf to make it make more sense visually. But so after I went through and I looked at each individual title, over half of the collection got new call numbers that better reflected the discipline or their subject matter. And so on the right is this book's new call number, which places it in the history of educational institutions, whereas before it was just in the American comic book literature section with everything else. And I did the same for the medical books as well. Anything that was a memoir of someone that focused on their medical condition or anything about the health sciences has National Library Medicine and went through the same reclassification. And then I've integrated this into the regular procedures for copy cataloging. So as soon as we get new comic books or graphic novels in, that's part of the step. We import the record, we clean up the record, we look at the call number and assign a new one if we need to, just right off the bat, so we never have to do that giant project again.
I have to admit, and I'm a cataloger, there is always a disconnect between the user, the technical services staff, and the OPAC. Because if we're honest, our OPACs have these great search features, and most of our users never get beyond the main search screen. So some of the questions that we thought about in our catalog: can users tell that a title is a graphic novel? Can they limit their searches to the graphic novels? Can they easily navigate the search process? Can they find items on the shelf after searching? And what can you actually change? Because there are some things that you can't change within your OPAC just because your vendor isn't interested. So to show you an example, this is from the Metropolitan Library Systems OPAC. It's the first page of search results for Wonder Woman. And like so many OPACs, the main search screen is a keyword search. So this is actually pulling up any records for anything that contain the words wonder and woman. And if you sort by relevancy, it's not too bad. And it says, if you notice, that the format of the item is book, but the cover image does make it pretty clear that it's actually a graphic novel. And Bethie, if you click again, when you get to the holdings, you can actually see that it's in the graphic novel shelving area. To be honest, it is possible in this catalog to limit your search results to just graphic novels, or to young adult graphic novels, or to records where Wonder Woman appears in the title. But realistically, our users are not going to do that. But it's important to make sure that those capacities are there and that your public service staff know about them and how to use those tools so they can help your users.
We deal with the same thing. We have a very similar faceting panel on the side of our OPAC, and it can't really sort by graphic novel as a format, but we do add a specific field to our records of every single title in our graphic scholarship collection, and that's just the 653 field, and we put in graphic scholarship collection, so that anytime we want to search for something specific, like say I want to search for surgery in our graphic scholarship collection, I can just search surgery and graphic scholarship and it'll pull up that search really detailed, and it's great. And of course, like Pauline said, users aren't going to do that realistically, but staff can know how to, and so we can help more. And then again, with the shelving areas, they're usually in our OPAC, they're really clearly distinguished, like this is in the second floor stacks, this is on reserves, this is on rotation reserves, but both the comic studies and the graphic novels are listed in the same location of graphic scholarship. So sometimes someone will go looking for a comic studies book and think it's on the graphic scholarship shelving, but it's one shelf over. And so we're working on how to fix that without making a really big new location project. But the call number labels are a slightly different color. So they're more of a brown for the comic studies. So it's easier to tell on the actual book, just not in the OPAC.
So some of the things that we did in the catalog, when you have a lot of works that are generally asked for, like a generic term like Pokemon, but all the titles don't contain that term, you can put it at the front of the title. And shout out to Metropolitan's cataloging and collection services departments, because they actually went back and did all the Pokemons about a year and a half ago. It not only helps with catalog searching, but it also keeps the group together on the shelf. And many graphic novel characters or groups are established as subject headings in LCSH, but you can use them locally even if they're not. Superheroes is an LCSH heading that we put it in all of the records for superhero graphic novels. Manga is now established as an LC genre form term, a 653. Depending on how your catalog handles that field, you might want to change it to a regular subject heading. The big thing is make sure whatever local decisions you make are followed consistently, because otherwise they are useless. And by putting all these subject headings in, it just means that the records will pull up when somebody searches those terms.
And speaking of decision-making, who's even doing your cataloging? When you're planning out your new graphic novel collection, think about your existing cataloging practices. Do you have local catalogers that are actual catalogers, or are you relying on technicians that have some cataloging knowledge? Are you doing copy cataloging? Does anybody know how to do original cataloging? Do you outsource your cataloging to a vendor? Do you import minimal records and then clean them up and enhance them when they get in, or are you getting full records from your vendor? So you may be limited in what you can do depending on how your cataloging is already being done. If you've got someone doing it in-house, maybe have them take a look at the best practices for cataloging comics and graphic novels document, which was released in the fall by the Graphic Novels and Comics Roundtable of ALA. It could be really helpful for someone new to metadata, as well as someone that just needs a refresher for comics cataloging. It's got really, really detailed instructions from the 008 field to how to list all of the creator relator terms. And it goes step by step, and it's fantastic. And it's available online on ALA's website, and Control F is your best friend. You can just search through it, easy breezy.
At Metropolitan, as I said, we did do all of our cataloging in-house, but it was important to have tech services staff on our discussion group, because we wanted to make sure that whatever decisions we made could be implemented quickly. We were adding a lot of materials to our catalog every year, and we couldn't expect our catalogers to spend 15 minutes on a graphic novel. So we worked really hard to make sure it was intuitive as we went along. So what about your existing collection? If you want to do retrospective conversion before you start, weed, especially for condition. Because if you're going to reshelve and relabel existing items, you want to do as few as possible. You may have to replace some, but it's more likely to be cheaper and to buy it and label it correctly up front. So when we decided to set the new shelving locations, we got the public service staff in each of the 19 libraries to help. We asked them to weed aggressively. We gave them a timeline for shifting materials and setting up their shelving areas. And we sent them graphic novel stickers so that they could start marking their own items. When we had to reclassify materials and relabel materials, take small groups, because you don't want to deplete the collection that's on your shelf. And take upcoming events into account. We worked around summer reading, which in a public library is huge. And we anticipated it taking about 2 years, but about a year and a half in, it was March 2020. So everything kind of got screwed up and it took a lot longer. Plus, initially, we decided the lower age limit was going to be 5th grade. And in 2022, and again, shout out to the existing staff, they went back and expanded into a lower age group. So you always have 2 major limitations: time and money. If
I
you
just
do
wanted
the
to,
work in-house, I'm sorry,
you've got about 5 minutes.
thanks. We
We're
always
almost
have
done.
two limitations: time and money. If you do work in-house, remember that staff time is money, as Bethie said, and it's your most important commodity. You don't want to create something that takes up so much staff time that it limits access to other materials. If you buy labels, if you replace labels, you'll be buying supplies you hadn't planned on, or you may have to delay until you can buy them. If you outsource, you may be paying to change your profile for new materials. Now, you might be able to consider interns or volunteers to help out.
And then finally, now that you've got your collection goals and your procedures sorted out a bit, sort of, it will always be a work in progress. Nothing will ever be definitive. But once you've got your guidelines set and your plan made, how are you going to tell people about it? How are you going to market your new collection? Will it have a unique name, or will it just be the graphic novels collection or the comic shelf? Will it get a logo? This isn't super common, but it could add an extra bit of recognition to your collection. I've included the logo from my library's collection as an example, which was created by one of our librarians, Emerson Moreau. So it took staff time, but we didn't have to outsource graphic design talent. And then what kind of signage will you have? How good is the existing wayfinding in your spaces? How will you display your books? We use forward-facing cantilever periodical shelves, which lets most of the titles face outwards. And this sort of reinforces the visual nature of our books. But then we have the small subcollection of our comic studies texts that are shelved off to the side, like standard books. They're just spine out. But then also, if you're doing something funky with shelving, like these forward-facing shelves, keep in mind your spatial limitations, because our collection has already outgrown this unit of shelving. This is the only one that we have. And so we've had to start transitioning some of these forward-facing shelves to traditional flat shelves to accommodate all the extra titles.
And I'll just throw in, remember that your public service buy-in is the key to making all of this work.
And then, will your library be doing any programming or events to tie into the collection? Or could the new collection be featured in existing programs like reading challenges or a new arrivals display? If your library has a newsletter, social media, or even a news section on its website, be sure to talk about your graphic novels. Users cannot be expected to engage with your collection that you put all of this time and money into if you never remember to tell them about it. And then that is it. That is all of our content other than questions.
That was fantastic. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm just going to look back at the chat real quick. We haven't had any let's see, questions, but y'all are welcome to put your questions into the chat. We've had some comments. I had
I've got a
wondered,
question.
yeah, go ahead, Parker.
So if you have two or more characters in a book, how do you decide where you put that?
In a public library, what our library decided to do, if it's a group of characters that has a name like the Avengers, we go with that. But there are things, are you talking about like Spider-Man versus Deadpool?
Spider-Man versus Deadpool, or like, yeah, something like Spider-Man versus Deadpool. Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, you can't put it in two different places. We always wish we could. So what we tend to do is, assuming that the two characters are equal parts of the work, then we go with the first character. But we do always make sure that there is a subject heading for the second character so that it can be accessed that way. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
And I've also put our email addresses on the screen. So in case anybody wants to have a more detailed follow-up discussion, or in case you've got a bolt to your next meeting, feel free to email me. I don't want to volunteer Pauline, but her address is up there as well.
The learning module feedback form, the link to it is now in the chat. Please, before you go, take a look at that. We did have some good comments. I had wondered if the visual learning or reading style of those who enjoy graphic novels correlates to the desire to physically browse a visually appealing collection. And Linda had said, I know that graphic novel users do like browse by series, even in an academic library. So at SWOSU, they separated it out. When I was at RSU, we separated ours out. It immediately started getting more use. Some people were talking about size constraints. Someone mentioned that they had a separate section for them, but it's getting so full that they're going to have to change it. And another person mentioned that their coworker, this is very cool, made a big graphic sign out of the letters spelling out graphic from old graphic novel pages.
Fun.
That's so cool.
I think in a public library, you generally assume that people are going to browse across the board, especially in their fiction collection.
Southwestern, we did move it to a separate collection, but we also, at first we didn't put that on above the call number, but we started putting graphic above the call number. And because that helped the shelvers and public services, because sometimes they would get put back upstairs, second floor. So that wasn't very good, but it seemed like when we did have them on in the general collection, they just weren't finding them. You know, they would.
That was kind of what we ran into in the public library. And as I said, it was people have talked about space limitations, asking 9 libraries, some of which were very small, to create 3 separate shelving areas turned into an adventure.
I bet it did. Again, that learning module feedback form is in the chat. Check your email, everyone, next week for the recording of today's session and the additional information that'll come with it. The email is going to be coming from michelle.owens12@OK State.
Can I add one thing?
Absolutely.
If you enjoyed this, please consider joining the OLA Technical Services Roundtable. It's a great group. We have really fun discussions. We're also kind of noisy because we laugh a lot, but we'd love to have you.
And also sort of an external plug, if you're interested very much in comics and comic studies, consider looking at the Comic Studies Society. They're mostly geared towards comics research, like scholarly activity about comics, but they do have librarians as part of the society as well with their own little cohort. And so about half of the presentations and topics of conversation at their conferences are from librarians.
Great plug. Did anybody have any final questions? Okay. Well, thank you both so much for presenting today. I really appreciate it. Everyone's very grateful in the comments, and thank you for sharing your contact information. It'd be a great way to stay in contact for more detailed questions. All right, that's it for today. Thank you guys so much. I'm going to stop the recording now.